Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
At my mom's holiday brunch, she raised her glass and said, "To the one who always brings us joy," and she looked straight at my sister Emily. The room filled with little nods and soft laughter, the kind of family approval that has always seemed to orbit around her like she was born with some magnetic glow that I was missing. I forced a smile, but inside I felt that same familiar ache I have carried since childhood, the one that comes from realizing you are invisible in your own family. I knew at that moment, while everyone else sipped champagne and exchanged warm glances, that this was going to be the last time my mother humiliated me like that. Because this time, I came prepared. It might sound dramatic, but the truth is that growing up with Emily as my sister was like living in a constant shadow. Every achievement she had, no matter how small, was treated as a milestone worth celebrating, while anything I accomplished was either ignored or compared unfavorably. When Emily got a part in the school play, she was the star in my mother's eyes. When I earned straight A's, the response was usually something like, "Well, of course, we expected that." The message was always clear: Emily brought joy, and I was just there. You'd think at some point you get used to it, but you never really do. You just learn how to bury the sting so it doesn't control you. Or at least I thought I had, until that brunch. I'll admit, part of me wondered if maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just a holiday toast and nothing more. But if you had lived through decades of watching your mom gush over one daughter while barely noticing the other, you'd understand how much weight a sentence like that carries. I sat at that table, my stomach tightening as I smiled politely, and I realized something important. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. This was about me reclaiming the space I should have had in this family all along. It was about finally saying enough. The weeks leading up to that brunch, I had started piecing things together, noticing details Emily probably thought no one cared enough to pay attention to. She liked to talk about her new business venture, dropping hints about how well it was going, always making sure to add that she was the one supporting mom in her later years. And my mother just ate it up, praising her generosity, her drive, her sacrifices. But what they didn't know was that I had already stumbled on a few things that made her so-called success look a lot less glamorous. Let's just say some people in our town had started whispering about Emily, and I decided to do a little digging of my own. I hadn't planned to use it during the brunch, not at first, but when I heard Mom make that toast, I couldn't help myself. That's when the idea crystallized. This was the perfect stage. I should tell you, sliding that document across the table wasn't something I did lightly. I thought about it for days before. I knew once I did it, there would be no going back, no pretending like we were a happy little family where everyone just politely avoided the truth. I knew it would shatter the image my mother had built of her perfect daughter. But I also knew it would finally put me on the map in a way I had never been before. And honestly, I was tired of being quiet. I was tired of swallowing my words while my mom praised Emily like she was a saint. So, while the champagne glasses clinked and the conversation shifted to holiday plans, I reached into my bag, pulled out the manila envelope I had tucked away, and slid it slowly across the table toward my mom. I kept my voice steady, almost casual, but every nerve in my body was buzzing as I said, "You sure about that?" My mom froze mid-sip, the glass hovering near her lips, and her eyes darted from me to Emily. For the first time in my life, I had her full attention, and it felt like electricity. I didn't open the envelope yet, not then, because the real power was in the silence that followed. Everyone at that table sensed something was about to happen, even if they didn't know what, and I could see Emily shifting in her chair, her confidence cracking ever so slightly. And that's where I left it, because sometimes the best revenge isn't in the explosion, it's in the moment before, when everyone realizes the ground beneath them is about to give way. That brunch was just the beginning, and believe me, the best was still to come. After that brunch, after the toast that felt like another slap in the face and the moment when I finally slid that envelope across the table, I knew I had crossed a line I could never step back from, and the strange thing was, instead of feeling regret or panic, I felt a kind of steady calm settle over me, almost like I had finally given myself permission to stop playing by the rules of a game that had always been rigged against me. For years I had watched Emily float through life collecting praise, while I worked twice as hard for scraps of recognition, and I told myself I could live with it. I told myself it was fine because not everyone needs the spotlight, but deep down I knew that was a lie. Because everyone wants to be seen, everyone wants to feel like they matter, and my mother had made it abundantly clear who mattered in her eyes. That day at the brunch was not the first time I thought about exposing Emily, but it was the first time I realized I had enough to actually do it, and that changed everything. It started months earlier, when Emily wouldn't shut up about her new business venture. She liked to make it sound like she was the genius entrepreneur of the family, the one carrying us all into some bright future with her innovative ideas, but when I looked closer, things didn't quite add up. She bragged about clients who never seemed to exist outside her stories. She posted about deals that mysteriously disappeared weeks later, and she was always talking about money flowing in, but somehow she was constantly asking Mom for loans. It didn't make sense, so one evening, after another exhausting family dinner where she held court and I played the role of silent observer, I decided I was done swallowing the narrative. The first piece of leverage came almost by accident. A friend of mine from college now worked at a local bank, and one night over drinks, she mentioned offhandedly how some accounts looked strange, with money moving in and out like a shell game. She didn't name names, but she described the pattern, and I knew instantly it sounded like Emily. I asked a few innocent questions, the kind you can slip into casual conversation without raising alarms, and I left that night knowing that if I looked hard enough, I would find exactly what I suspected. Emily's business wasn't a business at all. It was smoke and mirrors. I started pulling threads quietly, careful not to let anyone notice, because Emily might act like she's above it all, but she has a ruthless streak, and I knew if she sensed I was getting too close, she would try to shut me down. I checked public records, I scrolled through business filings, I even reached out to one of the clients she bragged about, only to find out the company had never worked with her in any capacity. Piece by piece, I built a picture, and the picture was ugly. Emily was funneling money from one account to another, propping herself up with Mom's support while pretending she was some self-made success story. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became, not just because of the lies themselves, but because of how easily Mom had believed them. It was as if she wanted to believe so badly that Emily was flawless that she never bothered to ask questions, and maybe that was the part that stung the most. I could accept Emily being manipulative and selfish, but watching my own mother turn a blind eye, watching her choose to protect the fantasy instead of seeing me, that was unbearable. By the time the holidays rolled around, I had more than enough evidence to blow Emily's little empire apart, and yet I hesitated. A part of me wondered if I was becoming exactly what I always accused Emily of being, someone who manipulates, someone who schemes in the shadows. But then I remembered every birthday where Mom's gift to me was an afterthought, every holiday where Emily's successes were paraded like trophies, every whispered comment about how I was so serious, or not much fun, and I told myself this wasn't cruelty. This was justice. The night before the brunch, I sat at my kitchen table with the envelope in front of me, going over everything one last time. Bank statements, printouts of fake client lists, even screenshots of her online boasts paired with the reality I had confirmed. I thought about what would happen when I revealed it, the shock, the denial, the fallout, and I realized something important. I wasn't doing this just to hurt Emily. I was doing it to finally make Mom look at me, really look at me. Maybe for the first time in my life. And as I sealed the envelope and placed it carefully in my bag, I promised myself one thing: I would not back down this time. No matter how messy it got, no matter how much they begged me to stay quiet, because silence was the role they had assigned me my entire life. And I was done playing it. What I didn't realize then was how quickly Emily would sense that I had found something, and how far she would go to keep me from using it. The strange thing about deciding to finally stand up for yourself after years of keeping quiet is that you expect it to feel empowering right away, as if the very act of preparing your move will suddenly erase all the old insecurities. But the truth is it doesn't work like that, because when I first confronted Emily privately with what I had found, I didn't feel like some fearless warrior exposing the truth. I felt my throat tighten and my palms sweat, because deep down I was still the same girl who had been told her entire life that she was second best, and the weight of that doesn't just vanish, because you suddenly have proof that the golden child isn't quite so golden. I chose to meet her at a coffee shop, partly because I wanted a neutral space where she couldn't just storm out without making a scene, and partly because I knew if I brought this up at home, she would spin it into another story where I was the jealous sister causing drama, and Mom would lap it up without a second thought. Emily arrived in her usual way, breezing in like she was already late for something more important, tossing her bag onto the chair, ordering an overpriced latte, and smirking as if she was doing me a favor by showing up at all. I let her chatter for a few minutes about her so-called business deals before I pulled out a single sheet of paper from my bag and slid it across the table. It was a record of one of her accounts, the one that showed the money moving in circles, never actually growing, never actually connected to real income. For a split second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, a flash of panic maybe, but just as quickly it vanished, replaced by the same dismissive smile she had perfected over the years, the one that always seemed to say, "You don't matter." She leaned back in her chair, sipped her drink, and said, "You really have too much time on your hands if you're digging through my finances. Do you have any idea how pathetic this looks?" And in that moment, I realized she wasn't going to crumble the way I had imagined. She wasn't going to beg me not to tell, she wasn't going to admit to anything, she was going to double down, and if I wasn't careful, she was going to make me look like the villain in my own story. The conversation spiraled fast, with her accusing me of jealousy, of obsession, of trying to sabotage her because I couldn't stand living in her shadow. She even threatened me, not with anything obvious, but in that subtle way she has where the words are sharp but cloaked in sweetness. "If you push this," she said, lowering her voice so the people around us couldn't hear, "you're going to regret it, because you don't know the whole story, and trust me, you don't want to." For a moment, I almost believed her, almost wondered if maybe she had something on me too, but then I reminded myself that the only power she had ever really held was the power we all gave her by staying quiet. Still, I walked out of that coffee shop shaken, because I realized this wasn't going to be as simple as dropping a bomb and walking away. Emily was prepared to fight dirty, and if I wanted to win, I had to be ready for the fallout. On the drive home, I replayed her words over and over, the smugness in her tone, the certainty in her posture, and instead of feeling defeated, something inside me hardened. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my anger just to keep the peace, all the times I had watched Mom shower her with praise while barely acknowledging me, and I knew this time had to be different. I spent that night sitting at my desk, spreading out everything I had gathered, not just the bank records, but the fake client lists, the loan requests, even the screenshots of her bragging online. And I asked myself what would happen if I didn't just hint at the truth, but laid it all out in front of the people who mattered most to her. I imagined the look on Mom's face when she realized the daughter she had put on a pedestal was a fraud. I imagined the whispers from relatives, the shift in how everyone saw Emily, and while part of me feared it might blow up in my face, a bigger part of me felt a strange sense of anticipation. The private confrontation had shown me one thing with absolute clarity: Emily was never going to back down just because I asked her to. And the only way to strip her of the control she had over this family was to expose her in a way that left no room for denial. As much as I had wanted to handle it quietly, to give her the chance to admit the truth without an audience, I now understood that this wasn't a battle that could be won in private. It had to be public, it had to be undeniable, and it had to hit her where it hurt the most. So while she walked away from that coffee shop with her head high, thinking she had scared me into silence, I drove home already planning my next move, knowing that the real fight hadn't even begun, and that when it did, it would unfold in front of the very people who had always believed she could do no wrong. When the holiday brunch came around, I walked into my mother's house with the kind of composure that felt almost unnatural, because inside I was a storm, but on the surface I knew I had to look calm, collected, and maybe even a little detached. Since if Emily or my mom caught the slightest trace of nerves, they would twist it into weakness before I even had the chance to make my move. The house was filled with the usual hum of voices, the clatter of plates, and the smell of food that Mom had spent days preparing, but none of it mattered to me, because every step I took felt like I was marching toward something irreversible, something that would change the way my family looked at me and at Emily forever. I had already rehearsed in my mind what I would do, and I had promised myself that no matter how much they tried to deflect, deny, or belittle, I would not retreat this time, because once you have seen the truth, pretending you didn't becomes a kind of betrayal to yourself. Mom had that same sparkle in her eyes she always had when Emily was around, and it was almost comical how transparent her favoritism had become over the years, though I suppose it had always been that way. She fussed over Emily's plate. She bragged about her latest business success to our relatives. She even joked about how Emily was the glue that held us all together, and I sat there listening. Not because I enjoyed the sound of it, but because I wanted the memory of her words to fuel the decision I had already made. Emily sat across from me, perfectly at ease, flashing her rehearsed smile, making everyone laugh at her stories, but every time her eyes met mine, I saw the flicker of something darker. That little twitch in her expression that told me she remembered our conversation at the coffee shop, and that she wasn't sure how far I was willing to go. The moment that sealed it came when Mom stood up again with her glass, as if she couldn't resist making another toast, and I swear I knew exactly what she was going to say before the words even left her mouth, because she raised her voice slightly and said, "To the one who always brings us joy, my Emily." And there it was again, the sentence that had cut into me my whole life, the declaration that in her eyes, there was only one daughter worth celebrating. I didn't wait this time. I didn't swallow it like I had 1,000 times before. I reached into my bag, pulled out the envelope I had been carrying like a loaded weapon, and slid it across the table in her direction. The sound of it on the table was louder in my ears than anything else in that moment, and while people were still raising their glasses, I leaned forward and said in a voice steady enough to silence the room, "You sure about that?" The hush that followed was almost cinematic, though it felt more like suffocation to me, because everyone froze, including my mother, who had her champagne glass halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting from me to Emily as if she wasn't sure who the target was yet. Emily's smile faltered, just slightly, and I watched her hands clench in her lap, a tiny movement that only I caught, but it was enough to confirm that I had hit the nerve I was aiming for. I didn't open the envelope myself. I let it sit there like an unexploded bomb, because I wanted my mother to make the choice. I wanted her to be the one to pick it up, to decide whether she would keep pretending or finally look at her perfect daughter without the blinders she had worn for decades. Nobody spoke at first, not my aunts, not my cousins, not even my uncle who usually filled every silence with some corny joke. All eyes were fixed on the envelope, and then slowly, my mother reached out, her hand trembling just enough for me to notice, and pulled it toward her. She didn't open it right away, maybe because she was afraid of what it might contain, maybe because she was still clinging to the hope that this was just another one of my melodramatic episodes, as she liked to call them, but I saw the doubt seeping in. I saw her looking at Emily and registering, maybe for the first time, that something wasn't right. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice low but firm, saying, "Mom, don't. It's nothing. She's just trying to stir up trouble again," and she gave me that look she had given me my whole life, the look that said, "You will never win." But for once, I didn't flinch. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and said nothing, because I knew I didn't have to. The proof was all there, every fake invoice, every false client, every piece of evidence showing how Emily had built her so-called success out of lies, and all I had to do was let the weight of it sit in the middle of the table until someone finally acknowledged it. What happened next wasn't a dramatic explosion, not yet, because my mother didn't tear the envelope open right there in front of everyone. She held it in her hand, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together, and the room stayed tense with the kind of silence that makes you realize the ground beneath you is already shifted even if no one has said the words aloud. And as I sat there watching Emily squirm in ways she had never allowed herself to before, I realized I had achieved something more powerful than I imagined, because in that moment, I had taken control of the story, and no matter how hard they tried, They couldn't shove me back into the shadows where I had lived for so long. The brunch didn't end with shouting or screaming, at least not then, but I could feel the storm building under the surface, and I knew the real fallout was only a matter of time, because once the truth has been placed in someone's hands, even if they refuse to look, it will gnaw at them until they can't avoid it anymore. The moment the brunch ended, when people started clearing their plates and pretending to have somewhere else to be, I realized that silence can sometimes be more violent than shouting, because nobody dared to look directly at me. Nobody wanted to acknowledge the envelope still clutched in my mother's hand, and yet the tension was so thick it felt as if the walls themselves were carrying the weight of what had just happened. I stood there watching Emily pretend to hold herself together, straightening her hair, faking little laughs, telling anyone who would listen that I was just acting out again, but her voice cracked in ways I had never heard before. And for the first time in my life I saw her scrambling, not in control, not untouchable, but panicked beneath the surface. That alone was enough to tell me I had struck deeper than she wanted to admit. The hours that followed felt surreal, because my mother avoided me entirely, as though looking me in the eye would somehow force her to face the reality she had been running from for years, and instead she clung to Emily, whispering to her in the kitchen, trying to comfort her, almost as if she were the victim in this story. I went home that night expecting the phone to ring, expecting some eruption, expecting either Emily or Mom to demand an explanation, but the house stayed quiet, and that quiet was worse than any argument, because it meant they weren't ready to confront me. Not yet. It wasn't until 2 days later that my mother finally called, her voice strained and unusually formal, as though she were speaking to a stranger. She told me she had gone through the documents, that she had looked at everything carefully, and while she didn't want to admit it, she could no longer deny that Emily's so-called business was a facade. I thought hearing her say it would feel vindicating, but it didn't, not completely. Because instead of apologizing for the years she had dismissed me, she immediately pivoted into asking me why I had chosen to humiliate the family in such a public way. She told me I could have come to her privately, that I could have spared Emily the embarrassment, and the words stung more than I expected, because once again she was protecting Emily first, as if the real crime was me pulling back the curtain rather than Emily being the fraud behind it. I stayed quiet for a long time, letting her words hang in the air, before I finally told her that I had spent my whole life staying quiet, that I had swallowed every slight, every dismissal, every moment where she chose Emily over me, and that if she really believed I owed her more silence, then she had learned absolutely nothing. She didn't respond to that, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, heavy, uneven, almost as if she were weighing whether to keep fighting me or just hang up. Eventually she muttered that we would talk later, and then the line went dead, but I knew the truth. We weren't going to talk later, at least not in any way that would fix this. Emily, on the other hand, wasted no time trying to turn the tables. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face tight, her voice low but filled with venom, and she accused me of destroying her life, of being jealous, of trying to ruin everything she had built. She said Mom was devastated, that the family was furious, and that if I thought exposing her would make me the favorite, I was delusional. I let her rant, let her spew every insult she could muster, because the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she wasn't angry because I lied, she was angry because I told the truth. And when she finally paused to catch her breath, I looked her in the eye and said, "You've lived off lies for so long you probably can't even tell the difference anymore. But you don't get to make me invisible again." The look on her face told me that no matter what she said out loud, she knew the tide had shifted, because once the truth is exposed, you can't just shove it back in a box and pretend it never happened. She stormed out, slamming the door, and I stood there alone, strangely calm, because while I knew the family would never be the same, I also knew I had finally taken back the voice they had spent years trying to silence. The twist, though, the part one didn't expect, came a week later when I received an email from one of Emily's so-called clients, a name I recognized from the fake list I had uncovered. The person thanked me, not directly for exposing her, but for bringing attention to her shady practices, because apparently Emily had been stringing them along as well, taking deposits for work that was never delivered. They told me they had already spoken to others and were considering taking legal action. In that moment, I realized my move at the brunch hadn't just changed the family dynamic, it had set something bigger in motion, something Emily couldn't charm her way out of this time. So here I am, sitting with the knowledge that my family may never forgive me, that my mother may never look at me with the love she so easily gave my sister, but at the same time I feel stronger than I ever have. Because for once I didn't let them write my story for me. I forced them to see the cracks, even if they hate me for it, and I can live with that. Maybe they'll patch over it, maybe they'll retreat into denial again, but I know the truth is out there now, and Emily will never be able to stand in a room without wondering who knows, who doubts her, who sees through her. And if that means our family dinners are quieter, colder, maybe even broken beyond repair, then so be it, because I would rather live in the ruins of honesty than in the palace of lies they built around Emily all those years.